Countdown. Hi, my name is Sarah Smith, and I currently reside in Rexburg, Idaho. I am an apparel entrepreneur and major, and I am a junior and will be doing the designer portion of this presentation.
Hello, my name is Feline Elias. I'll be covering the historic events part of our presentation.
And I'm Alyssa Bunker. I'm a junior. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I'm going to be doing the fashion characteristics. And our era is fashion history, 1900 to 1909.
All right, in Paris, Charles Worth established the House of Worth in 1858 and famous for its haute couture, which means high sewing or high dressmaking, and typically made on an individual basis. It was Charles' son, Gaston, and Jean-Philippe Worth, who were in charge of it in 1900. Jean-Philippe had become the main designer at the time, and like his father, used dramatic fabrics and lavish trimmings. One of his famous wares was the evening dress. Gaston discovered a young designer who he thought had potential, but Jean-Philippe disagreed, and this young designer left the House of Worth. That designer was Paul Poret, and he became one of the biggest designers in Paris in 1903 until World War I. He took radical steps of getting rid of the constraining corset and would also use more vivid colors. Now, two of his iconic designs during this time period were the hobble skirt and the kimono sleeved coat. Now, what made the kimono sleeve coat very unique is that it was Oriental inspiration with a twist of having a Victorian print on it. The hobble skirt became extremely popular, but lost interest fast due to how constraining the legs were. Perret said that he freed the bosom, but constrained the legs, which were true. And when women were having more opportunities of freedom, they wished to have their legs freed. Another designer in this time was Mariano Fortuny. He was known for his ancient Greek inspiration with a unique pleated design. Only the rich could afford these since they were made out of a fine silk and made from a special technique. Unfortunately, historians have a hard time studying Fortuny's silk work since they are so fragile, and due to time, silk does become very, very easily damageable. This photo was taken in 1910. This is a picture of my great grandpa, as well as my great great grandma. They were taken, or this was the birth year of my great grandfather. And during that time, babies, even though they were boys, would wear skirts. And also during this time frame, women still wore high collar dress neck outfits.
Strikes, unions, and labor laws were popping up all over during this time of change, including the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. With these changes, more women were going into the workforce, and clothing was becoming more practical to fit that purpose. The world was becoming a more connected place with events like the World's Fair. In conjunction with the World's Fair, Paris also hosted the Olympics, and women were allowed to compete for the first time. We were becoming more health conscious. Doing activities like running and sports for health were now common. Sports were becoming more competitive and organized. Many sports had special clothing, which influenced the fashion of the day. In 1901, Queen Victoria passed away and King Edward VII was crowned. This is why we call this time the Edwardian era. The royal house has a lot of influence in many areas. We see the world's first vacuum cleaner. It was a horse-drawn, petrol-driven unit the size of a milk wagon. It was too large for a normal home, but after it was used for King Edward's coronation, it gained in popularity. 1902. We get the first Crayola crayons. The boxes were the same trademark yellow and green as they are today. 1903. British suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, an organization that campaigned for women's suffrage. 1904. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was finished and spanned some 6,000 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. They built it from the east and from the west, similar to our transatlantic railroad. The increased ease in trade and movement began setting the stage for many power transitions in the world and more Eastern influence in our fashion. 1905. The world's first Nickelodeon opened, called thus because the entrance cost a nickel. It was just a converted storeroom, but was the first theater devoted exclusively to moving pictures. The theater served as many as 7,000 patrons a day. 1906. An earthquake measuring 7.8 on the Richter scale shook the town of San Francisco. 30,000 homes were destroyed, and an estimated 3,000 were reported dead. The earthquake caused large portions of the city to burn. It took 2 days of constant firefighting to bring the fires under control. And Finland became the first European country to give women the right to vote. 1907. The first electric washing machine, called the Thor, was introduced, freeing women from hours of housework drudgery. 1908. Henry Ford, a relative of mine, introduced the Ford Model T, costing $850. This was nearly 1/3 the price of any other car on the market of that day, but still not cheap enough for the masses. Over the next few years, he perfected the assembly line production, bringing the cost down to $368 in 1916, making it much more affordable, consequently selling hundreds of thousands more cars than any other company, and helping give rise to the motoring fashions of the day. 1909. Bakelite, the first synthetic plastic, comes on the scene. If you're interested in ways the world was revolutionized by Bakelite, you can check out the recent documentary, All Things Bakelite, 1910. Women's Wear Daily, often referred to as the Bible of Fashion, begins publication. Halley's Comet made an appearance. There was cyanide gas detected in its tail, and a theory saying the gas could impregnate the atmosphere and possibly snuff out all life on the planet. This theory got very little support in the scientific world, but when it was published in the New York Times, panic ensued. People were buying gas masks, sealing up their homes, and preparing for the end of the world. The world, however, did not end, and we bravely continued to make bold changes in the fashion world. Thank you.
The characteristics of women's wear at this time were very different and unique compared to what we have today, but they could still be divided into a few basic sections. The first being undergarments. The first layer a woman would put on was a chemise and drawers, or open-legged underwear reaching down to about the knees, or combinations, which which put together the top and the bottom layers into one uniform piece. Next, a woman would put on her stockings, still secured with elastic garters. Next would come on the corset, which would change dramatically over this period from a sharp S curve to a more natural empire-waisted silhouette. And then a camisole or corset cover to hide the harsh boning of the corset, hip pads to give her a little more fullness, and petticoats to support her skirts. Next would be day wear. This would be worn typically during daytime activities till about just afternoon, and this would consist of a simple day dress, often made of cotton, linen, wool if it was a little bit colder, then a coat or shawl depending on the weather, her hat, which could vary in sizes, a common style being the Merry Widow, which was large and trimmed excessively with flowers, lace, ribbons, and even stuffed birds, or a boater hat, a more simple design wrapped with ribbon. Next would be her boots, which would button with thousands of tiny little buttons going up the sides, or lace up with typical shoelaces. Next would be gloves, which were especially important for maintaining the delicate feminine image of the day. And then a parasol if she had the money to do so, which would protect her skin from the sun, seeing how a pale complexion was still valued at this point in history. Next is active wear. As the suffrage movement continued to gain steam, women were becoming more visible members of society and taking on more traditionally masculine activities. Due to the influx of cars at this time, motoring wear was becoming more popular as men and women were riding together in cars. The riding habit, however, was still a popular article of clothing, and especially still sitting side saddle, since horses were still the most common mode of transportation for the day. Tennis outfits were also popular. These were typically lightweight and cotton, and allowed for ease of movement as a woman would go around the court hitting the ball. Lastly were cycling outfits, probably the most liberating of all the fashions in active wear. These could consist of short skirts that could even expose some of the leg above the ankle, or even a pair of wide-leg trousers, similar to men's trousers. These were controversial, yet women were quick to embrace them. Next is evening wear. Evening wear was often made of velvet, silk, satin, or intricately beaded. As mentioned before, at the beginning of the decade, the S-bend silhouette was still very popular, with the bust pushed forward and the hips pushed back. Gradually, thanks to designers like Paul Poiret, this silhouette would become more natural and loose, eventually resulting in the empire waist from 1907 to 1909. Jewelry and evening gloves were an essential part, especially of a wealthy lady's evening wear look. Jewelry was often pearl or with precious stones such as rubies, emeralds, and diamonds, and especially hair jewelry and feathers would complete her ensemble. And lastly, a pair of evening shoes, which had heels and were often trimmed with a ribbon bow at the front. Lastly, for special occasions, there was maternity wear, first brought to market by Lane Bryant from 1904 to 1909, wedding gowns, which often featured puff sleeves and lace, tea gowns, which were loose-fitting to be worn in the afternoon around tea time, which served about 5 o'clock, and morning wear, which was still dominantly black and heavy with crepe. These are my family photos. You can see the captions below. And here are our sources.